Hello, and welcome to Workforce Wisdom. I'm your host, Christy Bray, Chief Strategy Officer at PracticeLink. This podcast focuses on the latest trends in healthcare recruitment while showcasing innovative strategies, success stories, and fresh perspectives affecting the healthcare workforce. These episodes will lead to in-depth, thoughtful discussions with recognized industry-leading healthcare professionals, exploring the challenges of healthcare recruitment and beyond. Whether you're an experienced recruitment professional or just starting, this podcast aims to help you discover how experts are reshaping the industry, leveraging technology, and fostering inclusive hiring practices. Today's episode, People First Leadership, Rethinking Healthcare Workforce Strategies with Amy Lafko. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. Hi.
Hi. Amy Lafko is a leadership and organizational design expert, main stage speaker, author, and facilitator. Known for her People First method, she brings a step-by-step process to put employee engagement and empowerment into practice. Having spent 20 plus years in healthcare leadership roles, her work is inspired by her personal transformation as a leader. That inspiration and her energy is multiplied every time she assists someone with their own shift in mindset and intentions. Her book, People First, a proven method for an exceptional healthcare practice, was an Amazon best-selling new release. In addition to founding Consulting Solutions, LLC, and being certified in TTI Success Insight DISC, Driving Forces, Emotional Intelligence, and the Hartman Index Acumen, Amy has earned her MSPT from Ithaca College, her MBA from Loyola University in Maryland. So, let's just start with a little bit about your career journey and evolution there. But, really from a practicing physical therapist to taking on leadership roles in healthcare, what motivated that shift, or even just initially your interest in that, getting into healthcare as a calling?
So I grew up in a very small town, and my grandfather was the town doctor. And so I always thought I wanted to go into healthcare. My grandmother was a nurse, and with my grandfather being a doctor, I always thought healthcare. And then in 10th grade, I was given an amazing opportunity to be part of a Girl Scout. They were called Girl Scout Wider Opportunities. And I went to Little Rock, Arkansas for 2 weeks and learned about every healthcare profession there is. Fell in love with physical therapy. And then, through hard work, luck, I was grateful to be able to go to Ithaca College for physical therapy program. And it was an extraordinary program. And, while I enjoyed it as learning to become a physical therapist, some of the other things that were really incredible about it were the fact that I was the chair of our student activities board. I was, president of the chapter's PT association, those types of things. So I had the opportunity to also do a lot of leadership activity while I was in college. So it was a nice balance for me.
That's great. And I think the type of physician that your grandfather was, probably a little bit different than today's clinician.
Different. Yes, very, very different. But the love of helping people is still there. But yeah, it was classic. You went in, he had a few medications that he could dispense there. He still delivered babies as the town doc. Sometimes you got chickens for pay. It was a very different world then. And you had what now we see as the luxury of time with patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, probably made those house calls. That was in their regular,
absolutely,
everyday practice. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what inspired you to establish, the consulting company, and really how does your People First methodology differentiate your approach from a traditional, organizational development strategy?
Yeah, so I'll take that in pieces because, what inspired me to establish Cairn Consulting Solutions and really moving into this space, I had been chair and faculty for a leadership development program through our National Physical Therapy Association, and it brought me so much joy. And I just loved seeing when people had their own aha moment and really
Mhm.
had their own transformation happening, because that's what it really takes, is that internal transformation before we can have anything else.
Mhm.
And so I came into a situation where at work I was afforded this amazing opportunity to exit being, at that time I was the operations administrator for urgent care operations. So I wasn't even in physical therapy anymore. I was in our medical group practice. We had 5 urgent care locations, and there was an opportunity to exit that. And I thought, I'm just going to take a chance on doing this because I love it so much.
Mhm.
And that was in 2018. And then part of what happened was I really had the opportunity to see so much more when I was consulting with other companies about their leadership programs or what they were looking for, how they were designing things. And then during COVID, I had the opportunity to write my book, and that includes interviews with some incredible practices.
Mhm.
There's an OBGYN practice in Georgia that just, their physician owners really took ownership of what it meant to own a practice, as
Mhm.
opposed to um, just happening to own a practice, but someone else runs it. They really made that transition. And, I think about some of the interviews I did with these incredible companies during that book writing process. And that's what really clarified for me what made these practices different and more successful, was simply this concept that we put our people first. And so I started doing more and more research into that area. And the research is overwhelming when it comes to the value of saying, yes, we treat patients, but in order to achieve patient outcome success, we've got to take care of our people.
Yeah, I know there's a methodology in a book that I've read, really talks about EX, employee experience, equals CX, customer experience, or client, or whatever C you want in that, where it really, really does matter. And I've worked in organizations where the people first value is you can just see it. You just know that from top down is how the organization is focused. What are some of the core principles of the people first method, and how do they contribute to enhancing employee engagement and like we said, the organizational success you want from that?
Well, and I do want to pause just for one more second, just to get clear on what people first actually means. And you brought up this point about like customer service, or, patient experience versus employee experience. And one of the things that was really interesting, I was asked to go serve in urgent care. I was serving in the health system as the director of rehab for home care. And I was asked to go serve in urgent care because they were having 70% turnover. We were closing a location at least once a week
Oh, wow.
because we just couldn't staff it. Our, patient satisfaction scores were in the 1 percentile of Prescaney, which I didn't even know was a real number. I mean, so it was awful. We were getting complaints weekly. So they asked me to go serve there, and they said, "We want you to fix patient experience." I said, "Sure, sure, sure." And then I focused on the employee experience, because
Mhm.
patient experience is actually an outcome,
Right.
not the action itself. And so, when then what happens is people say, "Oh, people first, we get it." But I want people to remember that every member of their team, including themselves, is part of people first. And I think leaders often ignore their own needs because
Sure.
of either people or patients. But the concept is really that you cannot take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself. And when it comes to core principles of people first, the main principle is this understanding that people first does not mean saying yes to whatever people want. People first is actually strategies, structures, and leadership, where the focus is on clear communication, clear expectations, no surprises, and providing support for people to be successful. But I'll have people say, "Does that mean everybody gets off on Friday because they want off on Friday?" Of course not. But we need to be clear in what the expectations are, clear in why they matter. And I think that's another thing that people often leave out. And in People First, when I designed my company and I called it Cairn, Many people don't know what cairns are, but they're actually piles of rocks that you use to guide you along your hiking path. And so for me, when you think about building a pile of rocks into something tall enough to actually guide you on a hike, we have to start with a big enough foundational rock. And so much leadership development, so much structure design when it comes to processes at work start with what people are going to say or what they're going to do. But people first, everything starts with mindset and intentions. Think about it. Your organization has a mindset and intentions. It's called your core values, your vision statement, your mission statement, your purpose statement. And then as an individual, you have your personal mindset and intentions. So that applies both organizationally and from a leadership standpoint. And I think that's an important factor that we always need to be considering is everything about people first starts with what's your mindset and your intentions. Because if someone says, "Can I have every Friday off?" If your mindset is, "No, all that matters is the practice," well, then you're going to answer that question in one way. You're going to say and do things based on that. But if your no is based on, okay, what do I need to do to support this person and still meet the business imperatives? Now you're going to have a different conversation about how we're going to go about answering that question.
Yeah, I really like that example where you were there to fix, in air quotes, patient experience, but it is 100% an outcome of the work environment and those employees and what their
Yeah.
engagement level is. Yeah, and I think knowing the rehab space a little bit, it's tough. It's tough
Mhm.
for those employees and what they're going through. You're not getting that immediate satisfaction that I think a lot of people are used to now, that immediate
Yeah.
gratification of like, ooh, I put a Band-Aid on it. Now they're ready, they're back to full life. No. And sometimes those patients never get back to where they were pre whatever it was, accident,
Mhm.
surgery, condition.
Yeah.
So it's very tough work.
And I think that's true of all of healthcare. Our in urgent care, my goodness, the patients who would walk in and pretty much at the front desk say, "Okay, just give me my antibiotics and I'll go now." Or, we'd have patients coming in actively having a heart attack, and they're like, "I know I'm not well, but can you not send me to the ER?" And so the struggles and every different type of practice has those struggles with their patients, whatever that might be. And so I think it's just recognizing that and helping clinicians understand, okay, the setting you're in and the impact it has, but then also just letting them know you're there to support them no matter what.
And I think different environments that you have probably worked in, that rehab example, very different in terms of working with an OR or maybe ED staff, trauma staff, right? You get ICU staff, a very different level throughout the hospitals based on their patient mix and what they're seeing. Not that there isn't immediacy working on the med surge floor, because you have a core, but those individuals, nurses, techs, support staff, encounter just such a wide range. I think healthcare in that way offers so many diverse
It
careers
does.
in like, they would always, are you an adrenaline junkie? Like those people work in the ED or
Mhm.
on the trauma team, right? But
Yep.
it is an interesting study, I think, in some of those career offerings within the healthcare space.
And I actually talked to students about that very thing because I loved working in the ED. I loved getting paged down there. I worked at Shock Trauma in Baltimore, Maryland, which is one of the premier shock trauma hospitals in the country.
Yes, I'm very
And
aware with that hospital.
yes, and I mean, that's where I started my career.
Oh,
So to
wow.
me, trauma ICU, trauma care is fantastic. The things we did there. But that's part of the reason that I didn't enjoy outpatient. I'm like, why do I have to see these patients so long? Just let me
Yeah,
get them, what they need to get to the next step. And they're like, no, 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 Amy, outpatient is the next step. I'm like, yeah, that's not for me. And that's
yeah, sure.
okay. So it's not necessarily that you're in the wrong profession. It's just, are you in the right or wrong setting based on what you love and how you prefer to engage and interact? Are you fast-paced, slow-paced, risk-averse, whatever it might be?
Did you know PracticeLink is not only home of the most widely used online physician job board, but we also have our own magazine? PracticeLink magazine has not only won several awards, including 2 ASBE Awards of Excellence in 2023, but it's also completely free. Over 375,000 physicians and residents receive copies of PracticeLink magazine each year, and you can too by visiting practicelink.com/magazine. That's practicelink.com/magazine. Thank you for listening. Now we'll return to the podcast.
So when you talk about people first, and organizations obviously can come to you for assistance in implementing some of these changes, but what are some of the common challenges, or an organization that's thinking like, we need to fix something? How do they help, or how can you help, or what suggestions would you give them to help identify some of these, to get to overcoming them, or setting some strategies in place, working with you on some of those challenges?
The number one thing is making sure that we're actually working on the right issues. We see this in healthcare so often. A patient comes in with a certain set of what they think is going on for themselves. Oh, here's what I think is happening for me medically. But then when we do our x-ray, when we do our blood work, we realize, okay, actually, this is what's going on. So for a lot of my clients, they'll start by saying, listen, my team just isn't doing what it's supposed to do, or nobody seems to know what they're supposed to do. I'm having to do all the work and I'm getting burned out. So those are the reasons they come to me. But what we realize is that could be happening for a few different reasons. One of the main ones is often that people aren't clear on what the expectations are. And people will say to me, Amy, of course they're clear. They're a physician assistant in an orthopedic pediatric practice. Of course it's clear. Well, no, just like you and I were talking about the setting being different, I'm working with one pediatric practice right now, phenomenal organization. They run in a very traditional approach. Everything is proven methods. They go in a traditional hierarchy. And they were hiring people who were more out of the box thinkers and wondering why it wasn't working.
Sure.
So in some cases, it's okay, but you didn't even set the expectations clearly in the job offer. And you know this piece, where it's like, we're a traditional organization with deep proven methods versus we're a cutting edge organization looking to push the envelope in healthcare effectiveness. That attracts very different folks. And then once you get them inside your organization, that's going to create a different culture. And so you really need to spend the time identifying what you actually want. And so where I start with a lot of clients is we'll do something called the benchmark process, or key accountabilities, where we start by saying, what are the actual expectations? And, I've done dozens of front desk positions, and people are like, well, just send me that other organization's front desk key accountabilities. But then when we actually go through the process, we realize they're not doing the same things. And so front desk is not front desk. PA is not PA. At this practice, their physician assistants, it's more like a fellowship program versus you're going to jump in and be treating on your own in like a week. So
Yeah.
we want people to have real clarity about what the expectations are. And when I've done this process in organizations and we've said, okay, what are the key expectations? And then let's define success. Really success. I don't want to just say, all other duties as assigned and assume someone's going to know what that means in a job description. I want them to be able to say, we're going to have, 95% patient satisfaction scores. We're going to have positive peer feedback on your annual review. What does it actually look like, sound like, feel like? I have organizations where people will be in those meetings. It's the subject matter experts. And someone will be saying, well, wait, you do that, don't you? No, I don't do that. Aren't you supposed to do that? And then we realize, no wonder it's not getting done. People aren't aware. And so with organizations, when I start with them, we can start any place they want, but we always have to look at the foundation of how clear are your expectations, how clear is the definition of success, And then it comes down to communication strategies, whether that be through leadership, training, whether that be through engagement surveys. I'm working with a client right now, and that's where we started with an engagement survey. So we can really get a pulse of what we need to prioritize.
Sure. And I think that also resonates when you're hiring physicians and advanced practice providers, where we think physician, 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 like there are expectations built in beyond how many patients they see a day.
Yes.
It may be committee involvement, it may be some outreach work, but to the best of your ability during the recruitment process, going through those interviews is making sure you're aligned.
Yes.
Culturally, again, with the vision and mission of what needs to happen. Because you do see, I think, you get that, the voluntary leaves from people when they just depart an organization because they weren't clear.
Yeah.
I wasn't clear that this is the environment I was working in or the work that I would be doing. So yeah, physicians are the same. They're not, you just don't plug them in. Just like you said, the front desk is different in every clinic or hospital that you've been in. Yeah.
Well, and I think about, even when you're bringing a provider on, what motivates them? Are they motivated by learning for the sake of learning? And so they're the person who's going to want to be able to have continuing education dollars. And that's a priority for them. Or another, and if your organization doesn't do as much of that or isn't as robust, they might say no because that motivation's not going to be met. Or
Right.
is it someone who is motivated by that partner track? Whatever it is, being really clear about this is the way that we motivate people to succeed. And notice, we're not even talking about that extrinsic motivation of money.
No, absolutely not. And I know that, our director of GME that is having a lot of these conversations with new residents and fellows and providers, and money is not the first thing.
Yeah.
It really is. It becomes a balance between like work and life, and then what will I be doing, and finding what speaks to them or what motivates them. I think that's a great question that recruiters could be asking is what is your motivation, daily or in your life that got them to that point when they're interviewing, new providers.
Well, and a lot of people don't know how to answer that question. So, in my work with organizations, we actually use an assessment that looks at motivations as part of that benchmark. So we look at behaviors and communication, we look at motivations, and then depending on the position, we'll look at acumen or emotional intelligence. We play with some other ones, but those are the two cores that you have to have clarity on and you want alignment on. And you know what your ideal candidate looks like. And I always say, no one's going to perfectly be able to fit into that round hole of an ideal candidate. But there's a difference between, using a potato peeler and peeling off one layer to get them to fit into that hole versus, okay, we need an axe and we're going to shove them in there. And so I use assessments with my clients because they want a cheat sheet of like, where are we compatible and where are the gaps? And then I'm going to ask those questions to help sort through whether that gap is something we can teach to, whether it's something we can work through or not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's great because you do often find, especially in the physician shortage, where you are consistently trying to fit square peg round hole for organizations to get past that warm body syndrome.
Yeah.
Because it really, really does matter.
Well, and when I think about in our urgent care operations, when I started and we had 70% turnover, we had vacancies all the time. And yet we were hiring people who we knew weren't going to last.
Yeah.
One of my clients right now just said to me the other day, Amy, before we started using your selection process, we realized we were hiring 2 people for every position because we knew one was going to leave in the first 6 months. And when I think back to that experience with urgent care, we finally had to say, what's more important, to have every location open in theory, but not keep them open because we keep hiring the wrong fit, or to take a pause and say no to hiring the next closest living body and saying no to those folks so that we're actually saying yes to the right folks, which then started to transform the culture.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership development. I know you and I
Yeah.
were talking before we started in terms of the audience, and I think we have
Mhm.
folks who probably are thinking about, some leadership roles, or maybe they're already in that role. But within the mind of a leader, you emphasize leadership as a mindset rather than a title.
Mhm.
So, how can leaders cultivate that mindset to drive positive change within their organization? And then the second part, if you aren't a leader by title, how are you able to do some of that? So, kind of a two-part question.
I love that. So let's start with part A and really look at how our mindset, if we are in a formal leadership title position. And there's all sorts of leadership styles that people talk about: servant leadership, transformational leadership, transactional leadership. And those are the what we say and how we do our job. But people first leadership and the most effective leadership starts with, what's my mindset? What's my intention? Is my intention to plow through this performance review as fast as possible because we've delayed it by 6 months just because I didn't have time? Or is my mindset that taking 45 minutes with a team member to sit and talk about their experience, their strengths, their challenges, and the ways we can support them? That's an example about how we take any part of our organization, communication and structure, what we say and what we do, and we can pivot it to either get it done and get it over with because I got to get to patients,
Hmm.
or how am I going to be able to impact this person on my team so they can go impact the patient? The most important thing when it comes to leaders cultivating this mindset for people first is to, number one, get curious. It might not be your natural. You might have gotten your position because you beat out everybody else because you knew so much. But the best thing that you can do as a leader is get curious,
Hmm.
understanding where people are coming from, understanding what their experience is.
Where does awareness fit into emotional intelligence?
Great question. Awareness is the foundation. So, when we look at Goleman's work around emotional intelligence, when we look at some of the emerging science now around adaptability,
Hmm.
in both cases, the number one thing is awareness. And we can liken this to our patients. We have a patient come in and say, I'm not feeling well. If that's their entire vocabulary about how they feel, they can't tell us very much. And now we have to do deeper dives. Okay, I'm going to need to do x-rays. I'm going to draw blood work. I'm going to do this manual test to see what the results are. And so awareness is our ability to recognize what's happening to us, make a decision about what we want to do about it. And before we even decide what we want to do about it, it's understanding where it comes from. And so without awareness, we can't achieve anything else.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a fascinating topic. I've read several books,
Mhm.
on emotional intelligence, and when you tap into that type of resource and learning, it I think it does, number one, open your awareness, just like you said, to other things that are in play when you're having interactions, or work things that come up,
Yeah.
even in your even just non-work life.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, and this ties in really well to your second question, which was, what if you don't have the title?
Hmm.
One of the challenges in healthcare is we have a very small career ladders. In private practice, it's even smaller than it is in a health system compared to an academic medical institution. So there's not always opportunities to move up on the career ladder as quickly as we'd like. But the more skills we can collect and deploy in preparation, the more prepared we are, because we have to learn those things. So if I wouldn't have done anything different. And my vice president was the most phenomenal mentor, coach, and trainer. But boy, if I knew I wanted to go into leadership, is there an opportunity for me to take on a project at work where I now have to do project management? Is there an opportunity for me to join the interview team? Is there an opportunity for me to take on a student? Or how can I be part of the budget process? We don't have to own the whole thing to
Yeah.
be collecting those skills that we need for the future.
Yeah. I think another piece, a lot of our listeners will be AAPPR members.
Mhm.
It is a big involvement is that networking, but then you have the option to volunteer.
Yes.
Within AAPPR, many organizations are looking for volunteers where I know that's where I gained a lot of my first skills and learning, especially in the project management world of what you were doing. You touched on one of your mentors, so I want to ask, how has mentorship influenced your career, and then what advice do you have for folks who are looking to mentor the next generation of healthcare professionals because they're coming in the door? How do
Yes.
we help them? How do we help them gain some of those skills if they haven't worked in the environment before?
That's a great question. And before I jump into that, I have to say thank you for bringing up associations as a place to develop those leadership skills. I mean, think about my story. I was chair of our leadership development program for our national association, and now look at what I do for a living and how
Mhm.
translatable some of those things are. But you're absolutely right. Um, and quite honestly, if you can learn how to support and lead volunteers who literally have no extrinsic money motivation for being in this group, you really have to develop those leadership skills. So that's an excellent example. So now to your next question about mentorship. I think one of the things that successful mentors do is actually something that successful leaders do. It's all about curiosity. It's all about understanding the role of a mentor. If you are truly mentoring someone, it's long term, and your job is to pose questions, provide a level of accountability support, and guidance. But the difference between like a mentor and someone training you, and that's the reason I say my VP was a great mentor and a trainer. She trained me how to interview people, but she
Mhm.
mentored me as I thought about where do I want my career to go? What skills do I need to develop in order to get there?
Mhm.
How do I work through this situation? That's what mentorship's about.
And in part of that, I think a lot of what you've said, that curiosity, it's that continual desire to learn and to
Mhm.
get better, that people have inside of them. Outside of that, how do you encourage people to stay up to date, really on the latest trends in either leadership or healthcare specifically? I read a lot. I subscribe
Yeah.
to a lot of different modern healthcare, Becker's, a lot of different reports that
Mhm.
I'm reading all the time. But how would you encourage people to delve into that? How do you help them integrate that into their continuous learning process?
If our mindset isn't aligned with people first leadership, then our whatever book I'm reading isn't going to work. Whatever course I just went to isn't going to work because and I had one of my clients, and we finally had this moment where she said, Amy, I really can't. It is about the patient for me. I am willing to run over my staff to get to that patient to be safe and make improvements. And I said, okay, then do you really want to be a leader of people, or do you want to be treating patients? And she said,
Mhm.
I really want to treat patients because I can't affect change in the same way when I don't have my hands on the patient. So again, before we start to think about what book should I read, what class should I take, where does my mindset live? Do I want to be a leader? And do I want to take this course to learn how to have more self-awareness and self-understanding of myself, and then how to use those things to lead others? Especially for our physicians, our APCs, anyone who's clinical, we all go to continuing education courses. And when we come back, we acknowledge I'm learning a new technique. I'm going to practice it and I'm going to see how I do with it. It's the same thing with leadership. Okay, what's my goal? Well, I want to work on my communication skills. Well, what if I started to let the team know that, hey, when we're in our meetings, I really want to make sure that we're hitting the mark when it comes to meetings. And, I have a worksheet that people will go through that is about, the intention behind the meeting, the success of the meeting, and I'll have my clients have their teams rate the meeting. And boy, just that. Okay, wow, I got an NPS score of 6. There's some things I need to be doing differently here. So then I'm saying, what do I need to do differently so these meetings are more valuable?
Yeah, I think that's great advice in terms of that transparency in the process. I think sometimes leaders feel like they always have to have the answer. And it's okay to say, like, I don't know, let's find out, or work through some of that processing with the team.
Absolutely. And, we want to thank someone for raising a point of view that we didn't have, because now I can look at it from a different lens. And you're right. I talk about this all the time, that leaders often have this false belief that they have to have all the answers. They were selected because they were the smartest or they had the most experience. But none of us know everything. And one of the best ways to develop critical thinking in your teams is by asking them the question and seeing how they view it so that you can understand.
Yeah.
And so I think for leaders, what I'll often say is, before you give the answer, ask a few more questions. And at one of my programs, we just watched a great TED Talk about the advice monster that we all have in leadership. And actually, we can link it for your listeners. But it's really this idea that we want to give advice. We think that's what we're supposed to do. And so if we can just learn a series of simple questions, or one question that is going to pivot the conversation. So I'll often have people say, here's what, and then my question is, well, what do you think you should do? Or what have you tried so far? Or what could you do differently next time? Those types of powerful questions are going to get you off the hook of having to know it all. And more importantly, and it's going to teach that other person some critical thinking at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can be a struggle, especially, I obviously work from home, and we have such a big mix of full-time, work from anywhere folks or hybrid folks. It can be a struggle sometimes to engage in that virtual environment, you feel like you're pulling teeth out of people. How can organizations really, maintain that people first culture and ensure that team cohesion when you're trying to lead in that environment? You're not doing jumping jacks or it's just sometimes it can be difficult to engage people via a camera across the country or the world, and keep people focused on what the goal is or the desired outcome.
I love that you're bringing this up, because I am in the midst of teaching a program right now called Leadership in a Virtual World. And that is very intentional language, because people will say to me, well, what do I do in remote work? And I'm like, remote means that you are separated. Virtual is simply the medium in which you're functioning. But we focus on a couple small things. Number one, you might want to have shorter meetings, and who doesn't want shorter meetings, but more frequent touch points. So if you're not doing huddles, and even if you have a multi-time zone, you can still find an opportunity to create a huddle space for the day. And the huddle is really about, what is the work of the day? Are we all on track? Who needs help? What's a win that someone had? We're still bringing community. When you have those staff meetings, oh my gosh. So in this leadership in a virtual world training program, I brought in a lot of experiential activities, one of which is everyone pick up an object on your desk that represents you and tell us a little bit about it. The one woman in the program went back to her team and did that at the next team meeting. It turns out everyone on her team had Legos on their desk. Now, how weird is that? In a group of 9 people all over the country, and actually she's in the UK, they all had Legos. So that's become their team identity. And she said, Amy, we have someone new starting next week. I'm going to send her some Legos to show her that she's part of the team. You can do things like one word opener to get a sense of where everybody is. You can do activities within that team meeting that take less than 5 minutes to create a real sense of team dynamics, regardless.
I think one of the things that I enjoyed as a leader, implemented a weekly, and it was via email prior to huddle the following week, but a piece of that really included a celebration or then something they were struggling with also. I may or may not have been the one to help. It could be a personal struggle, right? My kid has been sick all week at home, so they're pulled away from learning a lot from, what was a barrier, right? But the celebrations became so vital, and especially during COVID, leading them through COVID, it really connected them on things that were happening in that week or that day with them. So I try and focus a lot on that. All right, as we get to the end of our time today, what trends do you foresee in healthcare leadership? And how can leaders really prepare to navigate these changes effectively?
I think the number one fact is that change is the constant. And so when it comes to what trends do you foresee in healthcare leadership, it's that the most important skills for leaders of today and the future are emotional intelligence, adaptability, and listening, communication, asking better questions and listening. And those emotional intelligence has been around for years. Adaptability is just becoming more and more relevant for folks. But when we think about, I did a transformational leadership webinar on Friday. It was a 3-hour seminar. And we talked about some of the transformations. And one of my clients said, we launched a new EMR last year. We changed billing systems. We outsourced admin and one other thing. And they said, and so this year, what we're looking to do. And I'm like, okay, now that doesn't even take into account for all of the, national conversation around healthcare dollars, Medicaid, Medicare. And so that shows me that for leaders, it's having the skills and the awareness to understand what's my team going through. Because I said, well, what worked, what didn't? We did almost like an after action review. And he said, I don't think we understood that when they said, I can't take anymore. I think we just didn't realize what all was going on for them because of how much we were changing so quickly. And we thought we were moving slowly as the owners of the practice. So it's getting your team skilled in adaptability, how to have grit, perseverance, hope, how to have the right level of stress in the organization. Some organizations have too much, some have too little. So there's no impetus to change. Leaders need to be clear on the vision. They need to be able to articulate that well. And so when I think about healthcare in the future, and I love listening to futurists and all the things that they talk about that might be possible, but my way of handling that as a leader is simply to be emotionally intelligent and questionability, having the ability to ask good questions and listen fully, and then have adaptability skills.
No, I think everybody, the only constant in healthcare is change.
Exactly.
So, so you have to you have to decide, buckle up if that's what you're ready for. But that's a lot of change that you went through from that example. Most
Yes,
organizations would be good to get one of those done in a year or a multi-year project. So they did ask a lot of
they
their
did.
people.
They
Hmm.
really did, and I think they just underestimated the
Hmm.
toll it was gonna take.
And I think potentially helping them or looking at their strategic plan where
Yes.
you've got some time built into that, a 3, a 5, a 10-year, process,
Yeah.
especially with how rapidly technology is changing. You could pick any one thing and it could move rather quickly or not. Like you said, some
Yeah.
people don't have that change mechanism built into their organization.
Well, and part of it is, the majority of healthcare frontline team members are gonna be high steadiness when it comes to their behavioral style.
Hmm.
They are gonna respond to a pace and change where they want it to be slower. I call this group the breadcrumb trail.
Hmm.
You can say to somebody, listen, we're going to change EMRs, and they're going to say, okay, tell me the week before it's happening. But for the majority of our frontline healthcare staff, research shows that 70% of them want steadiness. They don't want the boat to rock. And if we know that, then our role as leaders isn't to necessarily even slow down the change, but it's to
Hmm.
start more quickly in our explanation of the why behind it, dropping those breadcrumb trails so that we're handling it in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's great. A great differentiator. I think what we said at the beginning was the complexity of the people that work within the healthcare ecosystem, where we do have those folks, and being able to embrace all those differences where you're still driving the change or whatever outcome that you need from a situation is key to accomplishing the mission of what they set out to do. Well, Amy, I really appreciate your time today. On behalf of PracticeLink, thank you for appearing on Workforce Wisdom. For our listeners, please feel free to check out and reach out with any thoughts, insights, or questions you might have about what we covered today. You can email plmedia@practicelink.com. For more information about Amy and to inquire about her services, the book is at peoplefirst.com. You can also visit her consulting website at cairncs.com. Appreciate you joining us, and my name is Christy Bray. Thank you for listening.